Today, we will be talking about AI and economic development, our opportunities, challenges, and policy implications. So it's my very great pleasure to be welcoming our today's speaker, Thomas Wolff, co-founder and Chief Science Officer of HuggingFace. HuggingFace operates the leading open platform for collaboration in AI. And I'll be joined in moderation by Pierre-Alex Balland. He's a visiting professor at the Growth Lab, and he's the chief data scientist at CEPS, Center for European Policy Studies. And he's also the director of the AI World that allows us to follow the heartbeat of AI developments in the world. And Thomas will cover how AI is influencing dynamics in economic development and explore the key challenges facing policymakers and researchers as they work to understand and guide this transformation. So I'm going to now turn to Pierre-Alex to introduce our guests in more detail and then kick off the questions and answers. So welcome again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mohamed. Welcome, everyone. Thomas, absolutely wonderful to have you here. So HuggingFace is a major research lab in AI. This is what I would call the most loved company in the space as well, and probably the world's largest open source AI community. I mean, we can all agree on that, where anyone, you can be a student, you can be a major lab, you can build your first model, and you can share, improve, deploy together. So my first question to you is, where does the name HuggingFace come from, and what's the origin story?
Yeah, sounds good. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. Last minute, I know it was a bit hard to organize. Sorry, Pierre-Alex. And I think it's a great pleasure to be here. So HuggingFace started now a long time ago. We are dinosaurs in the AI world. We started 8 years ago. At this time, AI was not even a real thing, to be honest. There was a little bit of deep learning here and there, mostly vision. And we started as a game company. We wanted to use the latest advancement in vision to do kind of a new Tamagotchi that could see a little bit around and maybe make some fun interaction. And what we discovered is, well, vision was working already. Our idea for fun interaction around text were way too above the capabilities of the model in 2016. So that was LSTM, and the text generation was so bad that we even had a comedian in-house writing dialogues for the thing. And so at some point, we decided to pivot. And the pivot happened because we open source a research code that was making basically the usage of a model. So that was the BERT model from Google, very easy. And this got a lot of traction in all the research community. Surprising even to us, like in a matter of a couple of months, the whole research community in AI started to use our library. And so we decided in 2019 to pivot around building an open source community around AI research, basically. And as you saw, probably AI research quickly became applied research, became a practitioner, which became basically every developer almost nowadays, I would say.
How open is...
So I didn't answer your question, but the name comes from the game, which was a non-serious game for millennials. So we wanted a funny name, and we really liked this emoji. We thought maybe one day if we do an IPO, we'll try to push NASDAQ to allow us to have an emoji instead of a trigram. It remains to be seen.
How open is AI research these days? Like, how do you say, like, what's
surprising? Yeah. So I would say a couple of years ago, it was really worrying, I would say. And there was this disconnect between academia and private lab. There was this question, could academia even do anything in AI nowadays? And so we started one project actually 4 years ago, 2021, called Big Science, where we decided academia cannot keep up. We're going to find a big chunk of compute, and we'll try to see if we can bring academia researcher and private lab together to train. And this was a long project, 1 year. It worked quite well. We got 1,000 researchers involved in it. Maybe the only model that was trained by both people from Google and Meta in the same project. And so at that time, like 4 years ago, I was really, really worried. I would say nowadays, I'm quite optimistic. If you take the latest advance in architecture, if you take the transformer model nowadays, a lot of the developments have been done actually in academia. So it seems like people can still do really meaningful AI research, both on algorithm and also on data evaluation. I think most of the most tricky and interesting evaluations still really come out of academia. So I feel like it's stabilized. If it's stable, if anything is stable in AI, well, at a higher level of involvement than I would have hoped, or like when I would have been worried about.
Yeah, next.
And Thomas, so right now the Hugging Face Hub hosts more than 2 million models, which is just an insane amount of AI models, 500,000 data sets. So you're right at the center of this AI revolution. What do you see? Can you guide us and walk us a little bit through what you see as the big breakthrough, the big AI breakthrough that we should be watching right now?
So you can I encourage you to regularly go on the website of HuggingFace. We have this trending section, which show kind of what are the trending model. And it's kind of a good way to see, it's kind of short term, right? It's the past 1-2 weeks, but you see kind of what is currently happening. And there is some trends, definitely, it's not random. For instance, 2 weeks ago, there was a lot of model around OCR and document recognition. Around the summer, there was like a bunch of speech model recently, very strongly. I would say if you abstract away a bit and if you take kind of longer time scale than just the 1-2 weeks, the big trend we've seen have been the two big trends we've seen over the past month, I would say, have been the reasoning model and the push for coding model. So a lot of models are kind of moving to this right now, both in closed source and open source. We had one very good model released a couple of days ago, I think 2 days ago probably, which is Minimax M2, which is a very good reasoning model. It's top 5 on the artificial analysis. There is some strange secondary effect, which is some people complain that the model are less good at some empathic communication because they're so good at coding. So I was discussing with an entrepreneur who is still using Claude 3.7. I was like, why do you use 3.7? It was like, the new one are very cold and we can't use them in our interaction, like in our chatbot type of thing. So yeah, there is this very strong trend toward kind of science and verifiable thing. I think this will keep going. Outside of the model, we see all this RL environment where people try to set up small environment with a nice reward that works really well for coding and try to have model do more and more self-training in this environment. I think that's a big thing. And we'll see, I think, more and more models on this type of more verifiable, grounded application, I would say, code first. The other big trend we see is on the other modality. So there was a strong rise of speech model. I think the level of speech model has increased dramatically over the beginning of 2025. And something we saw a little bit, but is more, I would say, beginning is the interactive world models. So these are this image that you can walk in through. There is a couple of building blocks in open source right now with one very good image video generation. And I think we'll see very soon the next step, which is the interactive world model. So I would expect that to come in a few next month. Maybe the last one, if you followed, maybe what I do is robotics, which I think will be a big trend in 2026.
And like some people, when you talk about this AI developments, they often say it's not the increments, the developments in the algorithms or the models are important, but the most important revolution was the scale. We weren't expecting scale to be that important in these models. Like
not so much. No. It's surprising, right? The size of the model has plateaued in a way. We don't have models that are 600 trillion parameters, right? Like the top seems to be really around max trillion. The open source model, people train way smaller model also for longer. And I think the main difference is really around the data. And it's also maybe more, so a question I get often is what's going to happen where we start to have this Stargate compute basically on the market next year? Will we see like, really like the closed source model strongly going up and the open source model maybe plateauing? It might be, but I think I'm way more worried about this coupling between the data for these two type of models. So one reason company like Mercor or Scale just before are getting this crazy valuation is because they really make thousands, millions of annotation, a very expert annotation for closed source model. I don't see exactly the equivalent for open source model. So I'm more worried about the data actually gap that might be growing between these two type of model than the compute gap.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm. And Thomas, it really looks like right now AI is the engine that's keeping the economy running, right? So I want to connect AI and the economy at the moment. So if you look at Nvidia, for instance, I mean, this week it was valued at 5 trillion. It's completely insane. I mean, Apple was the first company to pass the 1 trillion bar, and that was in 2018. So I mean, the numbers are just crazy. Nvidia project to have 150 billion revenue this year. And you have about 10 companies right now that are pulling up the US market. Otherwise, we're like, flat or in recession. So, I mean, can we see this belief that AI will keep powering the economy actually running, or is that I don't want to use the word bubble, but that's also a big conversation. So how do you see the link between the expectation basically that we have in this technology powering the economy and productivity growth and the reality of the technology?
Yeah, you're a bit doubtful about the $1 trillion IPO of that OpenAI is preparing next week. Yeah, it's a wide question. I think. I mean, data is a good example. I think there is this bubble is nice to in a way. Bubble is nice to bring a lot of capital here and kind of allow this crazy data annotation and like compute thing that we would not have really be able to even catalyze and start and spark otherwise. So I think it's a good way to kind of get this. I'm quite doubtful, like you, that basically we get really meaningful revenue that warrants, like $5 or $10 trillion company with a meaningful gap between the revenue and the market capitalization of this company. I think it's a big question. The main reason I think it's still really nice to have this bubble is just to be able to kind of see this Apollo program around AI taking shape. And this may have also beyond revenue, like a lot of side effect that I'm very interested in seeing. To take one example, for instance, training these models, there is a lot of discussion right now, AI for science. Can we use this model for scientific breakthrough? I think this is very interesting. And there might be also surprising side effect here. Let's say the technology we developed here is a technology that maybe just like the industrial military complex is a technology that will have like side application that may be themselves extremely important. Let's say we develop very good chips to do like GPU are improving very strongly. We have a lot of competition there. These same chips are the ones that are also used to accelerate scientific computation that's used for both modeling like materials, but also when you like SpaceX is a huge user of scientific computation. All of this will be actually accelerated by as kind of side effect of building this infrastructure. So that's one reason I'm careful to maybe, I don't want to deflate this bubble. I think it's going to be very useful even if maybe I'm quite doubtful that just selling tokens, for instance, like OpenAI is going to do, will really reach like a $1 trillion business. And I'm not sure the business model we see right now to power this valuation is really the end business model that will be the dominant one. Maybe just like at the beginning of the internet, like the first business model was making website for people, and like maybe some people I thought at this time this is going to be the dominant web business model on the internet, will be just making website for company. And then we have companies like Uber, like Airbnb, using the internet in a totally different way and make it actually way more, money and value, and just using it as a medium. And I think probably will move around this, which is the business model are going to evolve quite a lot. And the one we see right now are maybe not the one we should project, the final product to be.
And following up on this, like if you think about not just the business models or the production model or the way that we do our jobs or occupations, we think AI might have an effect on those. So how do you think AI is going to disrupt the economy in in multiple ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's one reason I came here, but I came here to learn because I think you thought a lot more about this question than me. Yeah, that's one of the things we wanted to do. And maybe that's just to tell a little bit the story of why I'm here today is that 1 year ago, we started to discuss with PLX after our slush. And one thing I told him is that we have a lot of data about how people use the model, the open source model, the one they download, how much they download, where they download from, what type of models are the most popular. And I was like, we are not data scientists, but maybe this data is interesting to understand the AI world today, or at least the counterpart of the open source, of the closed source model. And so we started to explore these insights. And this kind of brought to me the idea that, okay, we start to see this year, I think, the first real impact of AI on the job market. There is a couple of things. There's, you know, like I was reading coming here, the canary in the coal mine paper of Eric. Well, okay, maybe, you know, like entry-level jobs are starting to be disturbed. And we start to see that. And there is two reasons I'm very interested in this. I think is the first one is to try to understand that better and see if our data can also maybe provide some insight on this, maybe useful. And the second one is that the mission of HuggingFace is also to see if we can nudge the community that's around HuggingFace, which is roughly like 12 million builders, in some direction that we think are good for society. That's always a thing. And so I'm trying to understand how this transition is happening and see, okay, is there a good way to nudge? Is our role, for instance, to try to nudge people to start their own business? And maybe it's easier to do with open source, and maybe there is something that's easy. But I need to understand a little bit better, and that's, I think, the very interesting discussion I want to have maybe this afternoon with some of you. How does it work in terms of augmentation of people? What do you measure? Automation, maybe reskilling, maybe also a discussion about maybe, you know, expertise being less needed and some people with less expertise be able to rise to a higher level of expertise and use this tool. And so all this movement, I think, is something we want to dive more this year and see if we can help.
I think like we also, at the Growth Lab, especially in the Kennedy School, we are thinking about economic development. And we try to understand how AI could be also interacting with economic development. Pierre-Alex, do you want to continue along those discussions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we're very much looking forward to the conversation this afternoon that's really going to focus on AI in the future of work, where we are, what to do next, and hopefully also how can we leverage the absolutely unique data that you have to understand better the impact of AI and also to nudge, you know, society in a better direction. I mean, like these are wonderful objectives. So thanks so much, Thomas, for being here and taking the time to discuss this. The one thing I want to add is that we start to see layoff on the job market. That is for sure. Now, there is no consensus whether it's really fully AI driven or not. Somehow when you see, you know, like 50,000 layoff at UPS, 30,000 Amazon, 11,000 Accenture, and sometimes the leaders, the business leaders, the CEOs, they justify this. Think about Amazon, for instance, with 30K layoff. They say, well, that's to invest in AI. Now, the question is like, is that really the technology itself that's pushing toward layoff or not? Because if you look at Walmart, the CEO of Walmart has a completely different perspective and say, we're not going to have layoff. We're going to use AI to augment our people and to do things better. And then you start to have also this paradigm that I like very much the quote of Misha Kaufman from Fiverr, who says, you know, with AI, small tasks are done. Medium level tasks, like hard tasks, become the easy task with the AI tools. And what becomes a hard task is what was an impossible task before. So there is really still right now in the community this debate whether it's going to really augment, you know, and push more need like for workers or replace. So I think this topic is really really core, and there is so much debate on that. But maybe to go back to the question, Thomas, on source AI. Something really shocked me this week. So this week we had the keynote, the famous, you know, the keynote that we all wait for every year by Jensen Huang, CEO of NVIDIA, basically talking about, you know, his outlook on the future of AI. And he really pushed a lot, a commitment on open source AI. And NVIDIA also commits a lot to, you know, build repos on the hub. And my question is the following. Are we going to start to see like the most open revolution, technological revolution ever, because if you think, and you were a patent attorney before, or patent examiner before, by the way, we love you for that because we use a lot of patents in the lab. But essentially, and it's interesting because then you have both sides, right? You have the complete, IP versus open source kind of angle. But in a way, what we've seen with the different technological revolution over time is a shift, right? From like really private secrecy or IP protected into like a more open race. So this is really changing also and changing our assumption from an economic standpoint. So is that what's going to happen? So the most open tech revolution over time, and what does it mean for growth and development overall?
Yeah, let me maybe structure that a bit to explain why we see that right now. Open source is a different way to approach a technology in that you become kind of an owner and builder of the tech. You're not just a user. So when you use a closed source model, you're given this API you're supposed to call, and that's it. And you have a documentation how to use it, right? It's like you get a car, you can enter, you know how to. Open source is different because you can build the technology. So it puts you in a different situation versus technology. You're not just a user. You can build it. The counterpart is you need to understand it, and that's why we do a lot of education on how to train this model, because it's kind of level of expertise is quite higher. But the consequence of that is anyone who wants to build something very innovative nowadays in AI usually start from open source. Not an application, but let's give me an example. Like right now, we had this rise of interactive world model, which might be a new form of entertainment between a game and a movie. Like you have an image, you can walk in it, you can integrate it. The company who build this type of new application of AI start from open source model because they try to build something that doesn't fit in the API that provided by closed source model, right? It's like you want to build a pickup, but you're just given like a normal car. So you need to adapt it. So they all start from open source. And so what we saw recently was that because the leading open source model were Chinese, a lot of the US company were actually starting from Chinese model. And it's starting to be kind of worrying, where basically your starting point is actually, technology that's built by another country, basically. In particular, not so ally in this case. And so that was one of the drivers to say we need to do open source also in the US. And we saw basically over the summer, like the government taking really a very pro open source stance. And then we saw also a couple of labs, like Reflection Lab, coming out with a 2 billion seed round around open source model. So I think when you understand really what people use open source for, it's quite natural that we really need to kind of push that. And I don't really see a future where basically we would come back to say this technology need to be closed just because either you say it's closed and then there's basically just 2 companies who are allowed to build it and every other startup you're not allowed to touch this, which maybe was the discussion at some point where we had this weird question about license to train model like a couple of years ago. Maybe we should be like very, but I don't think we are at all in this situation anymore. So this to say that I think open source is pretty safely now as a part of the AI field. It will always be kind of competing with closed source, and I think we'll end up with just like we have in operating system, kind of coexistence of both this closed source and open source aspect. I think it's really nice because, like you say, it's probably even more than software development. It's kind of a technology that's kind of a breakthrough. And so developing that with a big open source part is very interesting. And it's even more interesting when you see now the shift to robotics, where basically AI start to permeate a world that's not only bits, but also atoms. And people bring this kind of open source mindset to this. So we see this open source robotics company like Physical Intelligence, us, of course, or I was traveling a bit in China last week, trying to understand on the ground, the robotics company, what's happening there, how many there are. A lot of them are extremely pro open source. It's surprising. So we see this like diffusion of some concept open source that was very software started to like being also in hardware. I think it's a good thing. yeah, maybe like patent. So patent is decided you have to share your ID, and in exchange you have monopoly. And now we move to this non-patent AI world where you have to share your ID, and in exchange you get a little bit of mind share. So I think it's an interesting twist.
And does it also appear in your data? Like the developing countries are accessing using these resources efficiently, you think, or?
What do you mean by resources?
So, like these are open source, right?
Yeah.
And developing countries, do you think they are already using at the frontier of the AI technology by looking at their usage statistics on your HuggingFace side, or?
Oh yeah, a lot. Yeah. I think in developing country, open source is even bigger. Yeah, for sure. I mean, there is some definitely a program, but yeah, it's a large part of the. Also because the support for some language is pretty bad, I think, in closed source model. So yeah, it's a big trend.
And you touched upon China, and like we have all this tariff wars going on, all the geoeconomic stuff. How open source development / this geoeconomic pressures are interacting in your everyday life, for example? Or do you see that's becoming critical in the open source business models? And
so there is the same very strong push for open source at the governmental level, both in China and the US. So that's extremely interesting.
The cross-border?
The cross-border is, and open source is interesting because it's kind of a approach to technology who has no border, right? By construction, it's really hard to, make, like you have API, you can say you cannot access the API, you can block it. But open source, we've decided that you just download the thing. It's kind of borderless by construction.
But then you see governments try to limit NVIDIA chips being sold or semiconductor chips. So why not limit also at the semiconductor software level?
But it's really hard, right? What you would do, you have to ban a model and say this model is not allowed to be downloaded. But then there is so many ways you could be sharing it. It feels very impossible to put in action. With chips, you have at least something tangible. You can say you stop this thing at the border.
So you don't see software open source model in danger because they cannot.
There was some, there is maybe always risk, at least in the US. There was some discussion just before that maybe we should ban open source, but it feels very strange.
Alex, maybe last question, then we can return to the
last question. We could talk forever, but last question, and we open the floor for questions from the audience. It's about policy. So, of course, you talk with policymakers a lot. We actually met at a very nice policy dinner last year. What is your one message? Like, what do you want to change, and what would be your one message for policymakers in the context of AI and open source AI?
Yeah. I think mostly in my mind, but that's maybe because I'm an entrepreneur, but they're quite tied to entrepreneurship, which I think you should both let, for every country, like we met in Finland, we had this discussion, but I think you should allow, this network of entrepreneurs to build this new AI application. So they should have access to the technology, but they should also be able to build great companies. So this all kind of tied, in my opinion, regulation of, giving access to this. So let's take an example. If in Europe, at some point you didn't have access to the latest meta model, or you could not download them, or there was like a limitation, then what does it mean? It means that entrepreneurs that start in this country cannot get access to the latest tech, and they cannot build on top of it. I feel like this is a very bad way to kind of, try to basically have some sovereignty in a new technology that's appear. So I think it's kind of a tight thing of letting people be able to build the application there. And then the main question is safety, and how much we should, pre-anticipate the risk, or how much also the risk we anticipate are the right one or the wrong one. And this is definitely the trickiest thing, I think, to discuss. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. But let's open up to the forum. So maybe we collect 2-3 questions and the answer go like that, if it's okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Try to be short in my answers.
One thing we've seen in other open source business model areas like Android or whatever is that open source is sometimes it can be a way to share findings with lots of people, and sometimes it can also be a way to leverage the efforts of a community, but the open source standard or whatever is still controlled by some entity that uses it for their own benefit. And I was wondering, how do you see this dynamic play out in open source AI, and what are the real levers of power and control that exist in AI open source systems?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it's kind of it's very true in practice that open source is a great way to kind of establish a de facto standard, just because everyone starts to use and we had that, right? So we have our library, for instance, we kind of have de facto standard to share models. And then you can have mostly two choices, which is one that you decide to be like the guardian of truth, and like the person will make sure that the standard evolves in the right direction. Or you switch it to a foundation like Linux Foundation and decide like PyTorch that should not be owned only by Meta, but be kind of a commonly owned entity. Yeah, I think historically, I would say it works pretty well. This de facto style it's pretty quick, it's pretty fast, and there is this strong kind of almost social pressure from the community to do the right thing that actually have kept most of this, open source standard on very healthy direction. I think there's maybe a couple of community that diverge wrong, but in my opinion, but here also I'm very biased, but I think it's a pretty healthy way to set up a standard. Yeah. Versus the other way, which will be like we get a conglomerate or like consortium of companies decide for everyone.
Yeah, then let's ask 2-3 questions then.
Hi, my name is Tasin. So I completely agree with your point of making sure that the AI is not stuck into softwares, but also into products, so that we can scale them and like make sure that they are accessible to the general public, specifically the developing countries as well. So I was wondering that HuggingFace has these pre-trained machine learning models already. So I was wondering, what are your stands over vibe coding, particularly, specifically for people who not really have a complete computer science background, but with vibe coding, like, do you think that they will be able to catch up with the speed of the existing entrepreneurs? And if that is so, then like, how should they approach this entire thing? Because I suppose that you had a quantum physics degree and then you moved to building HuggingFace. So I was much more interested relating it with your own journey as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a strong proponent of vibe coding. I mean, I would say in a carefully, of course, like mindful way, like don't use it for everything. But I think we've done, for instance, that's a side project, not HuggingFace, but we've done 2 weeks ago a vibe coding hackathon for kids. So I have 2 kids, 9 and 12. And I think it's a very good way to do, a first experience of making software, like building a software. So of course it's a little bit magical. You just ask for this thing in your own language. It's also work in many languages, so that's very useful to break the language barrier because models are very multilingual. And I think it's a great way to kind of get quickly like a reward. I can build something and then a segue to dive into programming. I don't think it's optimal right now because, for instance, a lot of these tools code in TypeScript, which is maybe not the first language you would like to learn after you, because the way I would see it is like you vibe code something, it's very nice, then you want to understand a bit how it works, so we'll dive in the code, and that's kind of a segue to trying to understand how coding works. And so I see my son doing that, but yeah, he vibe codes, and then these main things are in TypeScript. So that's, I would say it's not fully seen, I think, by the company building that as an education courses that it could be. But for instance, so for in the new robot, we're doing a small tabletop robot that's super cute and very accessible. I wanted to be able to maybe vibe code something in Scratch for it so that you would use that as a learning algorithm. But yeah, I think it's super, I found this extremely interesting from an education point of view. Could it be a way to learn coding, to learn AI progressively? I don't think enough people really build a full curriculum around this. Like that's actually well organized. But for motivation, which is a part of it, and like for people realizing that they can have more agency and they can actually do really more things with AI, I think it's an amazing tool. Yeah.
Thank you. So last summer, I was actually analyzing AI's effects on labor market for the World Bank. And one of the concepts I had to grapple with was the idea of the jagged frontier or the capability reliability gap.
Oh, yeah.
And so this has huge implications on automation versus augmentation of workers. Do you think that's gonna go away? Do you think the future of the AI, we can eliminate the hallucinations or no?
No. I mean, the underlying reason for this jagged frontier is that maybe surprisingly, so I was at OpenAI yesterday, for instance, having lunch with researchers, and everyone kind of agreed this model, they just don't generalize. So we have to train them on every single thing. And that's connect to what we were saying at the beginning, like the crazy valuation of some of these data annotation companies, because really the companies just to push the frontier have to spend $100 million on it, or I think it's even $1 billion per year for XAI, for instance, which is catching up on everything. They have to spend this amount on data annotation because everything, when you want to expand the frontier, you need to label all of these things. So you take all these software, like for instance, computer use, you take Word, Excel, like SAP, NetSuite, you have to label all of that. There's no way, just because models don't generalize. And the consequence is if you don't label an area, then you're less good than your competitor who has been labeling a lot here. So Anthropic started very early to focus a lot on coding and doing labeling, a lot of labeling, and then doing a bit of self-training, but really like kind of extended annotation work on this area, and that gave them kind of like a strong lead in this area. And I think OpenAI less. So I would be surprised that this really go away because it's kind of a very manual process right now. If you look at the latest, for instance, OpenAI work, right, GDP, eval, I don't know if you saw it, they just list all the occupation of human in the US, classify them by the highest, value added wage and contribution to the national product. And then we say, we're going to take all of this, we're just going to label like crazy for all of these things. And so it's a very manual way of identifying pockets where you want to extend. And that's one reason also, it's important to see AI like that, maybe more. And it kind of question a little bit all, of course, the super intelligence kind of claim. We're going to get super intelligence next year because it seems like there is still something that's a little bit missing, in my opinion, to simplify will take off.
Thank you very much. My question was more on the safety side, which we're trying to balance with a lot of these concerns as well.
Yeah.
HuggingFace, of course, commented quite extensively on the EU's code of practice. My question was, what is one area of safety that you think is emphasized differently in the code of practice from how you would like it to be emphasized, and how you kind of view the effect of this difference in emphasis on growth moving forward?
Growth? Which kind of growth?
So economic growth.
Of the platform? Or
no, economic growth of countries in general, lower income countries.
I mean, maybe you can just explain. I don't see a super strong tie between safety and economic growth yet. So maybe just if you can explain me what you see as a
development is being constrained in a certain way, and that would have effects.
Because people being too careful in the development of some capabilities and then not, okay, for sure. Yeah, it's a big question. I think it's gonna be likely more and more relevant for sure. Yeah, in the future, we saw a couple of these things. So, for instance, GPT-OSS or Llama were purposefully not trained on some part, like typically biology were less trained than they could have been because of the worries about WMD and basically biological weapons. So right now, how it's happened mostly seems to be like partnership between, for instance, OpenAI and one specific biology company where they like allow this company to use the full extent of the models. So it's obviously a bit frustrating from a economic point of view. I would like to see more like a free market of actors being able to come and not just this one. I don't see any easy answer around that, because I think also I'm kind of more right now in the mindset that we should start to take safety a bit more seriously as well. And I think open source models should probably start maybe undergoing some of safety evaluation, simple one, but we should start a bit to evaluate, what they're capable of doing before releasing, using on our side the fact that we're often aware that the model is going to come soon. It's pretty easy to tell them, why don't you run it through this safety procedure? So I think that's something probably we should start to see coming I don't think the current models are really dangerous in some of the most stressful, most dangerous safety area. You can use them for misuse. But to be honest, I think most of the misuse in terms of deepfake is done by closed source models nowadays. So it's not really an open source problem. I think a lot of the deepfake that generated now, Sora is going to generate hopefully a lot of things. And there's fingerprinting, but it seems quite easy to post-process this stuff. So I don't think it's really an open source question, this misuse right now. But I think the capability and the more safety, real bioweapon, cybersecurity, nuclear risk thing, I think this is something that we'll need to take seriously into account. And if it's a limit to GDP growth, I think it's fine. I think we already have a lot of a lot of things to.
Very quickly, I'm from Ethiopia and wish to ask OpenAI's contribution to developing countries, to economic growth and development. It was mentioned earlier. My question is, are there challenges for developers, for example, coming from the least developed countries, such as lack of data, even deployment of already developed AIs, and so on and so on? And what are the recommendations, particularly in connection with economic growth, which is needed more in the least developed countries?
Yeah, it's kind of a case by case, but in some of these countries, it's kind of on all fronts. It's a bit unfair, but both they don't have a lot of data, so it's really hard to fine tune. The price of GPU are still pretty high for the price that they're ready to put. And then maybe the positive thing is I still think access to knowledge on how to train this model is pretty open, pretty good everywhere. So there is a lot of discussion on how AI is indeed accentuating this unbalanced and unfair economy, and I think that's pretty true. It's pretty true, unfortunately. So what we tried on our side, what we tried in the past, is kind of foster community activities. So we did a couple of projects on how to gather data set, national data set in various languages, try to see if we can help structure a bit the effort. But yeah, there's a limit. Also, just because of the number of speakers is pretty low in some. You're just in a slow data regime, so it's quite hard to solve this.
Following up on this AI production versus AI consumption, if you're not developing, do you need the GPUs, or can they still benefit from development outside, or they could? So AI product, because GPUs, you want to develop new models, you want to use them. But then once you have your models, then maybe they can be more readily used in developing countries or least developed countries. Yeah. So that impact could be also important.
Yeah, this is still extremely positive. And there is two ways to use your GPU, right? There is the training way, which is when you need a lot of GPU at the same time. And here, the nice thing about open source is we can kind of immortalize this training over many, many people. It can be, if you share your model, basically everyone who's going to use it kind of is a beneficiary of the number of GPU you put in it. So it's very efficient in this way. And then the inference way, thankfully, I would say is way less costly. And there is also a lot of hope that we can run that on cheaper hardware. So both CPU or even the new chips that are coming on the market. So yeah, I'm pretty optimistic there. So.
And Christian, maybe.
Hi, quick question. Do you think energy costs will be a bottleneck, or do you think there will be an energy intelligence multiplier?
What is an energy intelligence multiplier?
For each joule of energy now, for each token, do you think we will have to optimize for how much intelligence we can get out of it to overcome this bottleneck?
Yeah, of course. I think ultimately that's it. One thing extremely interesting here is there is still a factor here, which is the performance of your hardware, which is, for each joule, how many matrix multiplication can you do, right? But then once you pass this, the rest from the matrix multiplication to the number of tokens is kind of very fixed. And it's interesting because I said that in understanding, like for the first time, we have a very high level metrics that many people know, which is the cost per token, which is very widely known metrics, right? Everyone knows about it. Is actually you can take the revenue of OpenAI and you can even divide it by the price and you know how many tokens it generates, right? And this metric is extremely low level in the other way because the cost per token ultimately is just like energy cost plus how good you convert this in hardware. And I think this will have once you go in a stable regime, if we ever reach a stable regime in AI, it will mean that this conversion of energy in matrix multiplication will be the last bottleneck that we need to really push down. And this will be very interesting because that's where NVIDIA is strong, has a very strong dominance, but that's also where a lot of people would like to challenge this dominance and like to propose new way to convert electron in matrix multiplication. Yeah. So it's maybe the first time in the past where we have this very deep connection between something that's extremely low level and a matrix that's extremely high level, right? We didn't have that for the cloud. So the price of your data center or cloud hour was very weakly correlated to how many gigahertz your CPU was having, right? It was very like weakly. Now we have this matrix that's going to push hardware. Like it's very, I think it's one of the reasons that both NVIDIA is so dominant and also one of the reasons that there is so many excitement there around new chips. Yeah.
Question?
Yes. Yes, thank you for your presentation. I have a question concerning like the role of institutions like Station F in France in the development of HuggingFace in your idea. And if you think that if you were not in that incubator or in this kind of like institutions that are financed using public money, like how different do you think that HuggingFace would be if the idea of like becoming open source is also linked to this idea of like being funded by using public money?
Yeah, interesting. So there is a common misconception that HuggingFace was kind of started in France in Station F, which is very wrong. Actually, we came back really late at Station F. We were starting in New York in an incubator called BetaWorks, which is a great place. And for a long time, we were only in New York. So until COVID, basically. And then COVID was horrible in New York. Everyone flew away when the boat from the army came, a hospital boat to save people. So, and now it's pretty empty because nobody really came back. And that's when so 2020 roughly, that's when we started to have like more organized presence in Paris, basically as a way, and that we started to be really more in Station F. But I think for us, Station F didn't do much, right? So I think it's a great place for the concentration of startup, and it's always nice to have this type of incubator where you can be a bit with your peer, and when it's hard as an entrepreneur, you have someone to complain to, can understand, and it's not just your partner who say, why don't you take a normal job instead of being an entrepreneur? So it's nice to be able to complain with fellow entrepreneurs. But I think there is also a lot of things they could do more as a real incubator and accelerator of startup. I think for us, the reason we I think grew well was this combination of being in the US, so able to really raise capital seriously. We never managed to raise any capital in Europe. People were just closed door. Here we could really raise significant amount of capital. And maybe this combination with being an immigrant and French and not really maybe following exactly the Silicon Valley playbook kind of pushed us to do this kind of weird stuff of let's try to do open source community. Let's try to maybe play, our cards differently than in the, I don't know if it's not being in the Bay Area, just being in New York is maybe would have been enough. So it's hard to know exactly, but yeah.
Maybe last couple of questions.
Just following up on your final point there, do you see that trend continuing that we've seen in Sweden where it's easier to access capital? We've seen Lovable, we've seen kind of Stockholm establishing itself as a European or Scandinavian Silicon Valley. Do you see that trend continuing, or do you see other factors that might kind of limit the potential there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm very often in Stockholm. I think there is something quite unique happening there. I think there's a couple of countries in Europe where they have some advantages. So they don't have the, I mean, Sweden has also these strong design skills. It's very unique, I think, and bring very beautiful product like Spotify. So there is a history of beautiful product, Spotify, Klarna, like Voi, doesn't come out of somewhere. But they're also lucky that it's this country that's small enough that people need to think in terms of global market very quickly. And so Lovable was directly, even created there, was directly targeting global markets. And they could raise capital, but Lovable in practice is also a US company based in Delaware. So it's not, I would say, full, like maybe European company, but they kind of push this nice vision of building from Europe, which I think is very nice. Switzerland is another place where I see some people take inspiration, saying, okay, we're going to build like Lovable out of Europe. So there's a couple of, I think, quite strong ecosystem now in Europe. London is another one. Paris was, but it's always been complex. Because I think the main problem with Paris and France is that the country is big enough that you can think maybe that's enough as a market. And that's usually the failure case of all European startups, thinking their local market will be enough. And then they build something that's okay, but not huge. Yeah, we will see. It's always a question. Even in the US, right? We had this discussion recently how the like between New York and Bay Area, like it was maybe a little bit balanced when we started HuggingFace, but now the Bay Area is really taking super strong leads. And I see some people saying, I don't want to build out of New York because of this or this. So it's sure that in general, AI right now is kind of bringing kind of a concentration of people. Like these power laws are just everywhere in AI. People need to be in the Bay Area. People need to be in a couple of companies in Bay Area. So it's more at the moment bringing some concentration of power that we don't like, that at HuggingFace we think is not good. So we try to fight it, but it's a strong trend to fight. Yeah.
So I think that we are, there are classes starting soon.
Yeah, that's good.
So it's good to be coming to a close. And Pierre-Alex, do you want to say something before we close?
Oh, just a big thank you, Thomas. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Pierre-Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. It was wonderful, and we are super glad that you came. We will continue our discussions around these economic issues, but I wanted to hear what you think now. So we will see. So thank you all for coming. And please continue to follow Growth Lab for the next iterations of the development talks and academic seminars.